Here we go. Okay, we are officially recording. Oh, here's Kaylee driving home from tennis. Um, we're talking about the Dred Scott Supreme Court case tonight. This is December 8th, 225. And glad to see all of you here. Oh, here's Abigail coming on too. Great. Um, and I know there are a few other people who are on but don't have their video on, like Chris doesn't have his video on yet. Well, we're glad to see all of you here. I know we're starting into a busy time of year, so I'm very grateful you all came. Okay, we're going to start first with just if somebody could give, and others can chime in, give a brief summary of what you can remember off the top of your head about this Dred Scott case. Like what's the big deal here? What was involved and what happened? Anyone want to take a first stab at it? Was that a raising your hand, Naomi, or was that just fixing your hair? Aubrey's ready, tentatively, but we'll go with you, Aubrey. You're the bravest.
It was very complicated, but I think what happened was the owner took the slave into a free state territory,
Mhm.
and then took him back into slave state territory, and the slave sued his master, basically saying that he should still be free, um, and the outcome of the decision was basically slaves couldn't be citizens of the United States, and therefore, um, being in free state territory didn't like make them free.
Yeah, yeah, very good summary. Very good summary. You all heard that? Yeah, he was a slave, was taken into free territories. He thought, oh, hi, Rainbow. He thought that would make him free. He could sue for his freedom. Bishop, you've got something to add or to support?
Yes. It established very firmly that slaves were property, and so property could not sue. And also, to protect the rights of property, you must be allowed to take that property wherever you want, including free states. So it
Mhm.
basically abolished the Missouri Compromise entirely.
Hmm. Hmm.
What hadn't already been abolished by the 10 other compromises.
Right, settled. Right, right. So it was like he went beyond what he had. The Supreme Court decision went beyond what was strictly necessary. And they could have even said, oh no, they don't even have a case. We're not even going to hear it. You know how the Supreme Court can decide what cases they'll listen to, what cases they'll hear. And they could have just said, oh, we're not even going to hear that. That's a stupid case. He lost earlier. We're not hearing it. They could have done that, but that's not what happened. Oh, hi, Chris. He's still waking up. It's early. Abigail's not turning on her video in China either, so maybe she's sleepy. Yeah, very, very good. Okay. Anyone have anything else to add about something interesting they learned about it? Anna.
So I'm at the part where you said one or two paragraphs. And it turned out I read all, like the entire decision plus the dissent.
Oh,
And so I
yes.
got kind of like I mixed the opinion. And I found it interesting reading the dissenting opinions because the guys who wrote those, I don't remember exactly who because I don't
Yeah,
think almost
that's
anyone
okay.
remembers the obscure Supreme Court justice was from
Right.
over a century before. But I would say that it was kind of interesting seeing people looking ahead of their time. And nowadays, you're like, that is the opinion. Like, that makes so much more sense. But that, and it would be like, for them, it'd be like in their time, be like, what the heck? How is this possible? Like, these people have such nerve to be saying this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you for reading those extra dissenting decisions, which, I suggested you might want to read, but it wasn't required. Oh, Kaylee's got her hand up. Kaylee in the car.
One thing that I thought was interesting is how in the case they ruled that the Compromise of 1820 and the Northwest Ordinance basically that ruled them like void completely. And so it's like all this, work that we've been trying to keep the peace for so long, it's just completely gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like that's a good point that they kind of threw out the Northwest Ordinance. Let's see, I saw Rainbow's got her hand up. Rainbow.
I was gonna piggyback off of what Anna said,
Hmm.
on just like the missing parts, and in the like first document, it's the Tanner's, right? His like arguments first, and then the opposing side, and I think
Yes.
what Anna said about the opposing side being like really normal to us today and like ahead
Right.
of the time. That's like the opposite of when we look at this document. It's like I don't understand how some people could think this way and dehumanize like people of
Yeah.
color. And so yeah,
Right.
that's cool.
Right. Yeah. And to see that, oh, that wasn't everyone didn't feel that way. Right. Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you can really see that contrast. Okay. Great. Excellent. Excellent. Just description of what this case was about. What I want us to think about next is, how a lot of times I'll tell you that, oh, the job of a historian and therefore the job of you is to raise questions. What questions did learning a bit about this case? I mean, we're just kind of touching the surface here, really. What questions did it raise for you? And they can be simple questions about Dred Scott himself and his life or his family, or anything about the case. Like, what questions did you find yourself thinking, wondering about? How about we'll start with Bishop and then Sana and then Claire.
I had a question about what was the policy previous to this about bringing slaves into free territory?
Good
Were they
question.
usually freed or were they usually retained?
Yeah, very, very good question. Does anyone know the name of what the policy was called? It's like got a punchy name. It was called once free, always free. Once free, always free. Therefore, if you set foot in a free state, you were now always free. You were free because there wasn't slavery in that state, and therefore you were free. And the very interesting thing, Bishop, I'm so glad you brought this up, is there were precedents. It wasn't like, I mean, I remember when I first learned about this case, I probably thought or guessed, well, this must have been the first case like this, of someone suing for their freedom because they'd been taken into a free territory. And that was not the case, and especially not the case in Missouri, where he lived, at this time. Um, Missouri starting in 1820, so right around the time of the Missouri Compromise, when it was becoming a state, um, it was hearing cases from people who were enslaved, who felt they were wrongly enslaved, that often because of some, legal thing, or that they'd been taken into another free territory or free state, that they should be free, that they were unlawfully held as slaves. And the state had ruled in favor of many of those cases. And so they didn't go anywhere. They didn't go to the Supreme Court. Do you know why those cases didn't make it to the Supreme Court? Because they won. Because they won locally and nobody contested it. You can't, does anyone know that like the way to get to the Supreme Court, if you're like an individual? Bishop, do you know the sort of the idea?
Yes, if you're an individual, you have to initially be tried in a federal court and then appeal to the Supreme Court,
Mhm.
um, which I think was one of the reasons why he said that the case should be dismissed because Dred Scott went straight to the Supreme Court, right?
No, he went through the courts for
Oh,
10 years, 11 years in the Missouri court system
oh,
before going on. And the big
oh,
thing is you have to lose. You have to lose if you're the person, pushing the case, the defendant. You have to lose. If you win, it just
Yeah.
stays as a local case. So it might have some precedent like in Missouri. And there were these sort of landmark cases in Dred Scott's base state of Missouri that had given people their freedom based on just the type of argument that he had. So he was told when he found out about these sorts of ideas that they thought he had a slam dunk case. It was so clear. He should have won. That's why, people were encouraging him to do it because they thought it was going to win, and why they thought he should appeal it. Because no, you've got a great case. Push it. And but you can't, if Dred Scott had won in 1846, when his case was first heard in like a Missouri, St. Louis court, if he had won, it would have never gone to the Supreme Court. You have to lose to appeal. You don't appeal a case that you won. And but his case, sometimes he would win, sometimes he would lose in Missouri, but the other side, either his owners would contest it and say, no, that's a wrong decision, we're appealing it. Or Dred Scott would say, no, you ruled in favor of my owner on falsely, and I'm going to appeal. So either one was appealing, and so it went up the ladder and finally got to the Supreme Court. Okay. Any other
Yes, ma'am.
questions people, found themselves like, this doesn't make sense? Suna.
I have a question about after. You know how sometimes here if people don't like the results of something, like they protest or something?
Yeah.
Did anyone do that after his case?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Do people protest? Wow. Well, they certainly, people like Frederick Douglass, those of you who read either his excerpt or the whole speech, I just read most of his long speech today. And so in a sense, those people were protesting. Oh, hey, Annabelle. But I don't think people didn't like go out on a protest march, as far as I know, but that's a very interesting question. I don't think they protested. Like Lincoln in his speech about the Dred Scott decision, he says, well, none of us went out and tried to free him illegally or yank him out and take him to a free state. We didn't try to do that, So I don't think there was a lot of it wasn't like a George Floyd moment. Okay. But that's a very good question. Anyone else have any questions? Kaylee, you've got a question or a thought or wondering. And Christopher too.
I was just curious what gave the judge the idea, or I guess the right to say that it was unconstitutional to prohibit slaves from going into certain states.
That it was unconstitutional that it was unconstitutional to say that the slave was now free because he'd been in a free state? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, good question. Well, there were these sort of doctrines in different states that said that, that was a precedent. Once free, always free. And, before the Compromise of 1850, how many people remember what that was? Compromise of 1850? I hope you're salivating. And that basically meant that people couldn't go to a free state and be considered safely free because their slave owner could come up to that northern state and capture them. It used to be that I made it to Pennsylvania, great, I'm free. But now that was changed. And so now that was when people started going, former enslaved people ran away. They'd have to go all through the free states and go to Canada, because then that was a different country and no jurisdiction of the US anywhere. But that is a great question. Let's hear from Christopher. It looks like he's slowly waking up.
I was wondering if this case did this case like make the Civil War inevitable?
Oh gosh, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? Yeah. Any of you who are on your NHD projects who are looking at causes of the Civil War, this is brought up. What do y'all think? Did this case make the Civil War inevitable? Did it bring it closer? Anna, what do you think?
That's okay. So what I think part of the reason it made it inevitable is because like the slavery issue is growing so divisive, and it was saying like it was the definition like, are slaves people? Are they like lesser people, or are they not people at all? Are they property? It was kind of a complex issue
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that proved divisive in America.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it really was. I mean, people were talking about this means civil war. People are talking about it, even though at the same time, many people, oh no, 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 we'll find some solution. No, no, no. Of course, we won't go to war. No, no, no. Don't be alarmist here. Um, I mean, there are people in today's world in the US who are saying, "Oh boy, this is like civil war here," um, and others say, "Oh well, come on, you're just overstating the case." But who knows? These are great questions you have. Much better questions than last year's group. Don't tell the TAs. Okay, Rainbow, what's your thought or wondering or question or idea?
How did get to court as a slave? Like, did his owner have to like approve, or like how does that
Oh,
work?
that's a great question. Did his owner have to approve for this? If you were a slave owner and you thought you could decide everything about your slave, could you tell him, no, you can't take this to court? There was actually a ruling, or I don't know if it was a law or just, a regulation, but in Missouri, they said if an enslaved person who thinks they're wrongly enslaved takes it, sues in court, and they had a whole procedure for what they had to do, and it costs some money, which would be a stumbling block for many. But apparently the enslaved person had to be able to appear in court on the, appointed day and not be held back because of work that was imposed on him, and not to be taken to another area by his owner. So that was in the rules of Missouri. I don't it was probably different in other states, but Missouri had that sort of rule. They'd had literally hundreds of enslaved people put these sorts of suits in the Missouri courts, and not all of them won, but many of them did. Let's hear from Ethan, and then Darren will go across the top. Ethan. Are you trying to, are you able to speak, Ethan? Well, we're going to someone else at some time. Somehow we're not hearing you. Let's hear from Darren, and I see Jamie's also on board, and Marissa. We got everybody. Darren.
Yeah, I was curious. You mentioned slave catching, or like after a slave escapes or frees himself, they get, I guess, like someone is sent to the north to try and take them back. I was wondering, by the time of the Dred Scott case, was this practice outlawed or was it still legal?
Was nabbing an escaped slave legal to do?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, if the case started in 1846, that would be before the Compromise of 1850, when they strengthened up the fugitive slave law, made it tougher, made it so, Northerners had to comply and help out, and, the Southerners could come up to the North to find their enslaved person. And so it was worse, halfway through this journey of this case, it got worse. So it was still that was the precedent. That was what was happening. Very good question. Marissa, what's your thought or idea or question?
I was wondering, you said that like there had been some or many cases where they ruled in favor of the slaves.
Yeah.
So like what made this one different or
Yeah, very good
Maybe.
question. Like why? And I'm sure Dred Scott and his original lawyers probably thought, "Slam dunk, we got this," and then they were surprised. Apparently, one of the things that happened was, oh, like in today's world, it's like, oh, well, that was a Biden appointee judge, or that was a Trump appointee judge. So these judges have their political bent, and that was the case in those times too. That apparently just the earlier judges, when Missouri was just formed as a state, 1820s, 1830s, were fairly, they would hear these cases and they would often, not 100% of the time, but they would often grant people their freedom. Say, yeah, you were illegally held as a slave. They weren't saying slavery isn't a real thing and we support slavery. They weren't saying that, but they would say, in your particular case, you were held illegally. And so, but apparently by the 1850s, there were sort of new judges coming in, maybe new appointments, just different tone of the time. And judges were turning in Missouri, were turning against these cases. Like in these years in the late 1840s, early 1850s, there were like, in one of those years, there were like 20 cases of this type brought in Missouri, and only one of them was freed. So 1 in 20 was approved, for the enslaved person's favor, and the others were found, nah, you don't have a case, not a good case. And so it just seems like the tone of the times had changed and the judges had changed. Maybe there were new judges, who knows, but they were now sort of shifting. Maybe they thought, oh, we were too liberal there. We were too easygoing. We've got to tighten things up, that sort of thing. Who knows? But the tone had changed. Let's see if Ethan can. Do you want to?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Ethan. Good.
So I had a question relating to the Marbury versus Madison decision.
Okay.
So if Marbury was so familiar with the law that he was like appointed, why did he go directly to the Supreme Court if he knew they didn't have the like jurisdiction to rule in his favor?
Oh, you bring up a really interesting point. And well, just think about it. That was so early in our country that it really, people interpreted things differently and they didn't, everyone's testing out the rules and, he probably, thought he had a pretty good case and thought he could do it and was surprised. I mean, he was a Federalist, and Marshall, the new Supreme Court Justice, was a Federalist. Probably thought he had an easy deal here. But yeah, so it's an interesting thing, like how the whole idea of how cases get brought to the Supreme Court. They're often what are called test cases. Has anyone ever heard that term? Test cases? Does anyone know what that means? It means that some group of people decide that a certain law is not good and they're going to test it. Or they think they have a really good case, and if they can just bring it to the Supreme Court, they'll get a good ruling that they'll like. Their side will win because they're a good lawyer and they've got a good case. It's a slam dunk. And so they sort of create cases to bring to the Supreme Court. And in a sense, the Dred Scott case was a little bit like that too, that people were pushing for it because, well, why would like some lawyers be interested in pushing this case? Walter, do you have a thought? I know you raised your hand for something else probably, but do you have a thought on that?
Hey, and do you mind if I ask my question
Yeah, you
first?
can ask your question first.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm worried I'll forget. I'm really bad about remembering.
Right.
Um, okay, so I did a little more research on Roger Taney,
Oh.
and because I was kind of interested, about him.
Mhm.
Um, and I researched him, and it seemed like he is actually supposedly opposed to slavery on like a personal level.
Yeah.
At least
Very
that's what I
good.
read from Britannica. So like
Yeah.
he was opposed to slavery on a personal level. Like, why did he go so far with it? Like, he didn't have, even from a practical level, he didn't have to go that far in the
Right.
Dred Scott decisions. Like, why did he go so far if he was
Yeah.
supposedly opposed
He
to it?
could he could have just said, well, no, we rule that Dred Scott is still a slave. The end. End of the decision. But he chose to go much farther. And yeah, what Walter is saying here, that he was a slaveholder himself, but not a big slaveholder. He was never a plantation owner. Did anyone know that what state he was from? Did anyone catch that? He was from the state of Maryland, which was a slave state, but it's at the northern edge of the slave states. So he's, eventually, lived in Baltimore. So he lives in Baltimore. Yeah, people there had slaves, but they'd be house slaves. And he inherited some slaves, like maybe, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 slaves. How many people inherited slaves? Like Martha Washington inherited all these slaves from her husband who had died. And, other people, would get these inherited slaves. They were sort of like, and now what do I do with them? I've got 300 slaves. I didn't buy one of them. They were given to me. And so Tawny was his name, by the way, is pronounced, even though it looks like Taney, it's officially pronounced Tawny. It's okay. You can pronounce it how you want. But he had, just a handful of slaves, and he did decide to free them. What could he have done with those slaves if he didn't want them?
Sold them.
Could have sold them. He could have made, a good bundle of money. Hey, I can buy myself a nice house, and now I've sold these slaves. Right. He could have sold them down to Alabama. And he chose not to. He freed them. And he didn't have to do that. And I think, yeah, Walter, it's an important thing to realize, that often, like, these figures that we kind of vilify and as being, what an idiot, how could he have these points of view? They weren't, as I said last year, they weren't 1,000% bad. They might have had some redeeming qualities, or, maybe there's some nuances about their decision making that we don't appreciate today. But they might not have been evil incarnate. But yeah, his views did seem to shift in the public sphere. Anyone know what president had appointed him to be Chief Justice, by the way? He's a pretty important president in the 1830s. Walter.
Was it Jackson?
It was Jackson. I will tell you, last year, nobody knew that. Or they needed 7 hints. But yes, Jackson appointed him. He had apparently worked with Taney in some lower position. They tried to get him to be on the Supreme Court a little bit earlier in Jackson's term, and he wasn't voted in. He wasn't approved by the Senate. The Senate can approve Supreme Court justice nominees. But then later, guess which very important Supreme Court justice died during Andrew Jackson's time as president? He'd been on the bench for over 3 decades. Bishop.
Well, now the name escapes me. He was
the big one.
Yeah, he was the big one from Marbury versus Madison and a lot of those
Right.
early decisions. Oh,
Yes.
what's his name? Help me.
Walter, what's his name?
John Marshall.
John Marshall.
Yes.
Right. Good.
Thank you.
Right.
You're
Once
welcome.
you blanked out in it, I was blanking out. I'm like, John Martin? No, that's not it. What do I think? Yes, John Marshall. Thank you, Walter. Yeah, he died. He died Supreme Court justice, and he died. So now you have to appoint someone new. Supreme Court justices can hang in there for a very long time. And so he was appointed by Jackson. And he'd been in there from the 1830s, and now it's the 1850s. He'd been in there quite a long time too. And so, yeah, interesting. Let's see. Did we still have some other comments or questions from people just about the case? Something that, they wondered about. It didn't seem quite to make sense. Oh, Jamie, I see you in the dark.
I was just wondering, I believe after the the decision for the case was made, William Lloyd Garrison wrote an article about it, and
Okay.
that article mentioned disunion a whole lot. I was just wondering how popular the idea of disunion was with the people of the United States
That's a
at the
great
time.
question. Yes. Garrison, actually, for those of you who didn't read Garrison's response, Garrison wasn't really, he was actually in favor of the North breaking away from the South. And now, would Garrison have had, as a radical abolitionist who probably the majority of Northerners thought was crazy or way too radical, would he have had any sway, any political sway on, say, pushing the North to secede from the South because the South was so evil? Would he have? He actually even didn't want to be involved in politics. He wouldn't allow like his followers to vote or to, run for office, um, because the system was so corrupt. It just wasn't, you just couldn't even take part in it, that sort of attitude. And yeah, so I don't know. Does anyone else have any thoughts on what Jamie's bringing up? Like if Garrison is calling for, or if, alternatively, if the South wants to leave, good riddance, let them go. We can't stand them, and they're so evil. We don't want to be associated with them. Was that a popular belief in the North? What do you all think? You might not know, but what's your guess? Walter, I see your
I
hand up?
kind of don't think it was that popular because Garrison is like just this complete radical.
Mhm.
Obviously, did not share the views with the majority of the population, or he wouldn't be radical, right?
Yeah.
Radicalism is defined basically on the spectrum, right?
Right.
Are you in the middle, then you're not a radical, or if you're on the edge, then you are a radical.
Yeah.
So, if those views were widely held, then I don't think he'd be considered too radical.
Right.
And plus, it'd be really weird to think of the South, who became the Confederates, as the Union side. That would just not make sense. You know,
Right.
if the
Right.
Union was the Confederates and the Confederates were the Union, that would just be like, what?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
Right. Good point. And Garrett, they're kind of like two ways of looking at the Constitution here. And Garrison's on one side, and then there's another way to look at it too. And Garrison was on the side that said, literally, he would say in fiery speeches, like the Constitution is a, a deal with the devil. It's horrible. It's terrible. It promotes slavery. It should be the Constitution should be abolished. There's a famous incident in 1840 1854, to right after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, um, when he was talking at a July 4th, patriotic event, a July 4th event for fellow abolitionists around the Boston area. So it's this outdoor event. He's there holding a torch in his hand, while giving the speech in the dark. And then he picks up a rolled up copy of the Constitution, and he's saying, this is, a contract with hell. This is with the devil. It's terrible. And he lights it on fire. He takes his torch and he holds it to it because it's a very famous event. There's a good reenactment of it in the PBS series called The Abolitionists. When I post the recording tomorrow, I'll post that. I know if I played it here, it wouldn't come across very well, but it's worth watching. It's like 2 minutes long. Um, but he burns the Constitution. He thought it was a contract with hell. And that's a pretty radical thing to do, you know. And so that's what he thought, because he thought, the Constitution, why would someone say that the Constitution is in league with the devil because it supports slavery? What evidence would there be for that? What do you think, Walter?
okay, so I disagree with what Garrison was saying, actually, that it was that strong. I actually don't think the Constitution was that evil. But basically, it wouldn't have gotten ratified, right, if there had been, like, if it banned slavery in the first place. So
Right.
I think what he was saying with it, like, an agreement with the devil, it's like, okay, you had to agree with the pro-slavery people that you wouldn't ban slavery in there. And so it kind of just says nothing about it. And
Mhm.
nothing, say nothing is evil, therefore it's an
Yes.
agreement with the devil. I think that's his logic, which,
Yeah.
I think I see where he came to that conclusion, but I think it's a little, I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think I agree with that because
Right.
like we wouldn't have a constitution or a stable country or maybe even a country at all if it
Right.
hadn't been for the Constitution. So I
Right.
think that's an issue where unfortunately there had to have been, I think there had to be some compromise,
Right. Right.
right? And I think
And
it's a little bit unfair to call it like an agreement with the devil.
Frederick Douglass agrees with you or
Oh
agreed
yay.
with
I
you.
did a book review on him, so
Yeah, great. Yes, he was like Garrison was like the discoverer of Frederick Douglass when Frederick Douglass ended up in Boston after, fleeing from Maryland and his enslavement. And Garrison, hears him somewhere, somehow gets word of him, and they start working together. They, okay, I want you on my circuit of abolitionist speakers. I mean, there were professional abolitionists in those days. That was your job, to go around the country speaking, rabble rousing, giving talks, raising money for the cause, etc. And Frederick Douglass was very effective because he was a very good speaker, and um, he could tell his experience, okay, as a slave. So this was very persuasive to people. So Garrison, loved Frederick Douglass and wanted him on his circuit. But that was in the like early 1840s. And by the time the 1850s are coming around, Frederick Douglass is backing away from Garrison because of Garrison talking against the Constitution and being against any political activity. Like Garrison's basic idea was we should proclaim that it's evil and slaveholders should free their slaves. That's a plan, that's going to get you somewhere. Um, it didn't convince too many slaveholders in the South. It convinced some Northerners who felt in tune with the idea, but it didn't actually. Garrison's work in itself didn't, I mean, maybe it could be argued, but did it actually free any slaves? But Frederick Douglass by the 1850s is thinking, no, we need to be politically active. We need to get in there. And he had the view that no, Garrison is wrong about the Constitution. The Constitution, the argument was, well, would you say if you were making a positive argument about the Constitution that Garrison's wrong, what might you say? Kaylee, do you have a thought on that?
I was just going to mention something real quick about
Okay.
what I had read from the William Lord Garrison speech.
Okay, great.
I was just mentioning that he believed that the Chief Justice Taney should quote walk the plank overboard, and that weapons should not be laid down until quote liberty is proclaimed to all the inhabitants of America.
So the
Very,
Liberty
very
Bell, yeah, and
funny.
that he's taking their phrase that was the biblical quote, "Let liberty be proclaimed throughout the land." The biblical quote that was on the Liberty Bell. So people always love to go back to something from the Revolutionary War era and link their cause with that. So yeah, yeah, very good. Thank you, Kaylee. Um, anyway, Walter, do you have an idea here on how you
yeah,
might
another
defend the
idea about
Constitution?
yeah, another idea about the Constitution, like I think you have to credit the Constitution for its flexibility too, because while it
Mhm.
didn't ban slavery entirely in the first place, because
Mhm.
well, it wouldn't have existed then,
Mhm.
the framers still provided a way for that to happen eventually, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it didn't like the Constitution didn't say, all right, no more amendments, you can't add anything to this, or and also didn't like support slavery, right? It didn't say like this will always
Yep.
be,
Right.
allowed as long as this country exists, which the
Right.
Confederate Constitution, I mean, was basically just a rip off of the U.S. Constitution, but with
Right.
pro-slavery clauses, right?
Right.
But like the whole idea is that like it could be changed, right? You could have some flexibility, and so more
Mhm.
amendments could be added later. And so I
Mhm.
think that's another reason why it's kind of unfair to call it an agreement with the devil.
Right.
It allowed for slavery to be banned.
And it allowed for the slave trade. And let's see, Anna, do you have something? I see your hand up. And Abigail, too.
Yeah, I agree with what Walter said about the Constitution being flexible, because I think it was meant to be amended if it was like if something became outdated. I think the people who, like the framers, they understood that, and so they knew like, okay, society's going to change. There has to be a way to change this, but do it without unanimous consent, like the other court requires. And if you think about it, especially as America has grown, amending the Constitution would be very much impossible
Yeah.
if we still had the unanimity requirement. Is that the word unity?
Right. Abigail, do you have something to share? I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think I agree with Anna and Walter, and also like many abolitionists in their time also used constitutional arguments against slavery. There were a lot of people who argued that the constitutional did not, in fact, explicitly provide protection for the institution. And also, like, I think it's the only means that they can abolish slavery in that time because constitution is seemed like the base of this nation, the law that everyone looks up to and honor. So I feel like you cannot say that it is just simply a deal with the devil or just something entirely pro-slavery, but it's something that you can use to, in fact, turn it into anti-slavery. And the only official means you can do it is by, amendments and the later 13th Amendment. I think it's a product of that.
Yeah, very good point. Christopher.
Everyone pretty much said what I was gonna say, but I agree with what everyone said above. But also I think that the main reason about the Constitution was that it was interpreting kind of like the way it was interpreted was kind of flawed. I think that's the main reason why what caused all this conflict in the first place, because the words slavery and slave are not really they don't appear really directly in the Constitution. So
Yes, good point.
I feel like that the court read the pro-slavery meanings into it.
That's such a key point. And many of the people who said, like Frederick Douglass, who said, oh, no, 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 the Constitution is really an anti-slavery document. And they would point to that the word slavery is never mentioned. But as Walter said, the Confederate Constitution, which is basically very similar to the US one, mentions slavery a number of times and even includes a phrase that says, slavery may never be abolished. Like there can never be an amendment to make slavery, passe, that we can never allow that. And specifically said that anyone could take their slaves anywhere in the Confederacy, even if a particular state might, say, well, we're not going to have slavery anymore, you would still be able to take your slaves into that state. So it used the word explicitly, but in the real Constitution, it doesn't show up. Anyone know what the euphemism, what the sort of secret way of saying slave in the Constitution was? They didn't want to use that word, but they alluded to the fact that slavery existed and had to be dealt with. Anyone know what they said? It's a good phrase to know. It was basically, they didn't want to say slaves, but they would say persons held to service. Okay, persons held to service. That was the euphemism. That's the nice way of saying it. And people felt at the time that, yeah, we don't want to put the word slave in our founding document for our government. That would be a disgrace. And so Frederick Douglass and others would argue that the Constitution had to recognize people held to service within certain states, but it was only allowed because those states, those local areas allowed it. So slavery was local. And they said, what's national is freedom. So I actually have a book here. I will show you can anyone read this title? I don't know if you can. It's called Freedom National It's a whole book about this philosophy, this idea, this way of looking at the Constitution, that slavery was local, slavery was in particular states, and only allowed because those particular states or localities had said slavery is legal here. We recognize it, but it's not recognized nationally. Okay, it's not like the Constitution never said, oh yes, slavery, of course, is 100% legal. It just recognized this was a fact on the ground, which was one of those things I know we've talked about before, that these slave laws grew up in the colonies and they all started making their own little colonial laws regarding slavery because it was happening and they had to make laws about it. And it just grew up as a colonial colony thing, and then that became a state thing. We'll just translate our colonial laws about slavery into now our state law about slavery. So it was always this local issue, but it was never something that the whole nation had done. So that was the argument that Frederick Douglass began promoting. Frederick Douglass, I was reading more of his, long speech after the Dred Scott decision. He made a lot of references to, well, I know the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, but there's the Supreme Court of the universe. There's God, there's God's law. And he made a big deal of that argument, that there's a higher law. And that was something that a lot of other people, like the person who had become Lincoln's Secretary of State, Seward, if Ben Little were here, he lives in Alaska. Seward's Folly is what Alaska was called when it was first purchased from Russia. He was still the Secretary of State. Seward argued, yeah, there's a higher law. That may be the local on earth law, but there's a higher law, meaning there's God's laws. Okay. And so they would appeal to that, and they were all hoping that this Dred Scott decision could be done away with. Oh, I just want to tell you a couple of other questions I had before we move on. I wondered, could Dred Scott read? Could he write? How would he know about the possibility of suing or how you would do it if he couldn't read or couldn't read very well? Anna, what do you think?
I would say that maybe he heard his master. Other people talk about it because I read a book when I was younger. It's like learning about what it was life was like as a slave. And one of the things was like, how would you get news? And then one of the things that was mentioned was about listening to your master and his friends in discussion. So they may have been talking about like someone suing someone else, like, oh my gosh, this person did something to me. I could sue them for it. And he's like,
Yeah.
I can sue my master. Great idea.
Yeah, that's true. And often slave owners would say everything in front of their slaves, like if they're, as you said, Anna, at dinner with friends and they're discussing political issues or something, they'd say anything in front of their slaves who are serving them food and bringing wine or whatever. They would say anything because, oh, they don't understand anything. And slaves were listening and they were picking up. So yeah, that's a very good idea. And what do you think? Do you think Dred Scott could read, given the laws in most states about literacy and enslaved people? What would you guess? How many of you, we'll take a vote. How many people think Dred Scott probably could read? That, there were always some slaves who could. How many think that? How many think that, nah, he was a slave, he probably had no chance, he was illiterate? That's the correct answer. He was illiterate. When he and his wife signed their first suit, their freedom suit, it was called, suing that they'd been held illegally, they actually have this document. They unearthed it and found it. It's now, you can probably find it online. I haven't seen it, but it's available. But they signed with, you know how you signed if you couldn't write, make an X. So they both, he and his wife filed this suit and they signed with an X because they were illiterate. They hadn't had an opportunity to learn to read. And but I wondered, you know, again, I think that's a very good point that Anna made, that he could have overheard his owners talking about these issues. Another thing that I learned just last year was that Dred Scott's wife, who he married in free territory, by the way, when one of those times when he was taken up to, you know, Wisconsin territory or Illinois, and his wife back in St. Louis went to a church, a black church, that had a black minister who was a freeman. And that black minister had worked for an abolitionist newspaper editor not far from St. Louis, over in Illinois. Has anyone ever heard of the Lovejoy killing? The Lovejoy? Anna has. What do you know of that, Anna?
I think it was like a situation where they were trying to destroy the printing press of a man named Elijah Lovejoy,
Elijah
and
Lovejoy.
but he was trying to protect it, and so they killed him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Elijah Lovejoy. He was this editor, ran an abolitionist newspaper in this little town, Alton, Illinois, in southern Illinois, not far from St. Louis, and a mob came and destroyed his printing press, like broke in the middle of the night, set the building on fire, smashed up his printing press, threw it in the river, that sort of thing. Well, the man who had been his typesetter, the person who physically, you know, arranged the type to print the newspapers, was this black man who became the minister in St. Louis that Dred Scott's wife attended his church services. And so he was an abolitionist, and he definitely encouraged his parishioners to be up and aware of these sorts of rulings and laws and what you could do to, you know, if you had a legal case that could be made, he would encourage that. So that was an interesting thing to find out, another way that he could have learned about what was possible. I did hear this year for the first time. Every year I try to like read something new. You know, none of us can learn everything about any of these cases. But I get to learn a little something else every year. This year I found, you know, that photograph I showed you of Dred Scott that was on the PSDA page? That's the only photograph of him. Like, how many of you have one photo of yourself? None of you. None of you have one photo. You know, you've all got like 1,000 million digital photos. I mean, you may not have too many printed out photos anymore, but you've had thousands and thousands of photos that you've taken of yourself or your parents have taken of you. Rainbow?
I was just wondering how the slaves get married when they
Oh, that's a good
how to
question.
make that like official and like certification and stuff, I guess.
That's a very good question. And that was something I just learned about today too, that for Dred Scott, that he and his wife got married when they were up in one of these free territories, and they met. She was a slave, and but they met, and you know, both of the owners, the men, were in the army, and they brought their slaves with them, and they met, and the Harriet Scott, the wife, her owner was also a justice of the peace, and he performed a wedding ceremony, like a civil wedding ceremony for them in this northern territory. And that was very unusual. So they had a record of their official marriage, but usually slave marriages were not, there was no legal standing for them at all. They were not, they would sometimes have a little what can you say, a folk ceremony, like on the plantation or on the farm or whatever. They would do something and they'd have some tradition. You jump over the broomstick and now you're married. Yay, we'll have a party. They would have traditions, but it wasn't legally recognized. And even many states didn't have last names, a surname. They didn't have last names really because, and that just wasn't, they weren't really people, and that could have this. So, but yeah, so Dred Scott and his wife did have a legal wedding in this free territory, and that's an interesting twist on this. That's a good question to ask about. Oh, another thing that I wondered about this case was, okay, so Dred Scott's a slave. How in the world does he have money to pay for a case that ends up lasting 11 years and goes all the way to the Supreme Court and travel and everything else? What do you think, Walter? What might he have done?
Yeah, abolitionists help fund his expenses.
Well, they eventually did. At first, it's kind of interesting that the big abolitionists, like Garrison or something, didn't get behind it in the beginning. They didn't, like put money, they didn't try to do fundraising for it. Walter?
I think I might remember this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think was it like the children of his enslavers were actually like or no, they're like abolitionists, and so they were actually funding it,
Yes.
right? I think
Yes. Yes. Did you all catch that? His original owner was this guy, Mr. Blow, like blow up a balloon, Blow. And he had two sons. Dred Scott grew up with those two sons, like they were companions. A lot of times in a family that just had a few slaves, which this Blow family only had like a handful of slaves. It wasn't a plantation. But so they grew up and they played together. They were companions. So they knew Dred Scott really well. They were all friends, pals. And they became abolitionist minded as they became adults after their father died. And so many of these slave cases, too, are so complicated because it's not like, well, this Mr. Blow owned him. And so now he's the one who always owned him. And it went to the Supreme Court. And they said, oh, no, Mr. Blow still owns you. That was not the case. Mr. Blow died. And then so now what do you do with your slaves? Okay, they get, sold to somebody. We're dividing up the assets of the will. So maybe they use it, to pay for a debt or something. Okay, well, you can have our slave. We don't have $1,000, but you can have our slave. That sort of thing. That was very often done. And so somebody else ends up owning him. And eventually it's this guy, Dr. Emerson, a medical doctor. And he's the one who then worked for the army as a surgeon. And that's why he was going to these different free states. It was with the army. They told him to go there. So I think that was probably part of their argument. Well, I didn't just take him into free territory. I was told to go there by the army. And they said it was okay. I could take my slave. It wasn't like we were really in the free state. It was this army fort we were at. I'm guessing that was probably the argument. But so this Dr. Emerson, but Dr. Emerson dies too. And so now who would get Dred Scott? He was married, Dr. Emerson. So you think his wife is going to get Dred Scott? Do you think she wants to have a slave? She might, but she didn't. She said, she had not apparently traveled with her husband on his army travels. She stayed home in St. Louis. And she eventually decides, well, I don't want to handle this. This is too much for me. I'm going to let my brother, whose last name was Sanford, not Sandford, as the Supreme Court case is listed. They did a little spello on the name. It's known as, Scott versus Sandford, like sand you play in. his name was really Sanford, but someone misspelled it, and that's how it's come down to through history with a misspelling. But she said her brother, the Sanford guy, should be in charge of the slave because she didn't want to deal with it. She was going to move away. And she decided she was going to move away, far away. She was going to move from St. Louis to Massachusetts. Now, is Massachusetts a big slavery area or a big abolitionist area? Haley.
Slave, right? Because it was entered as a slave state and then Maine was entered as a free state.
That's Missouri. That's where she had been living. But now she says, okay, my husband has died. I'm getting out of here. I'm starting a new life. I'm moving to Massachusetts. So Massachusetts, that's the home of Garrison. Massachusetts, like the hotbed of abolitionism. Okay. And so she moves to Massachusetts, probably to Boston. And when she's there, she marries again. A lot of widows in those days, they would remarry. And she marries again. She marries this guy whose name, hold up, Chaffee. Hold up. Yeah, Dr. Calvin Chaffee. She seemed to like doctors. So another medical doctor, Dr. Chaffee, and she marries him in 1850. What other big thing happened in 1850 that you shall salivate about, Suna?
The Compromise of 1850.
The Compromise of 1850. So in that year, ironically enough, she marries this new guy. And it turns out he's not only a doctor, but he's a very strong abolitionist. He never asks her, like, well, now tell me, my dear, you're originally from St. Louis? I mean, are there any slaves in your family? Apparently, it never came up as a point of discussion. She's now in Massachusetts. Dred Scott and his wife, who have already started this case, had been going on for 4 or 5 years in Missouri, but she's not part of it. She's just the wife. She's left. She's in a whole new world, and she never mentions it, and he never asks, never thinks to ask. So he doesn't know that she's actually the owner of Dred Scott, who will soon be, like the most famous slave in the nation. And he finds out about this, that his wife is actually the real owner, 1 month before the case is decided. So people knew this case was coming. They knew it was going to be decided. And there was an article in a newspaper 1 month before, and it mentioned his wife's name as being the owner. And he's like, honey, is this true? And she's like, oh, yeah, I guess that's my slave. Yeah, that was a long time ago, honey. I don't have anything to do with it now. But she was still officially the owner, even though her brother had been put in charge. So this guy's an abolitionist. In fact, he was not only a medical doctor and an abolitionist, but he had run for Congress and he'd won from Massachusetts. And what do you think his fellow Massachusetts folks thought of him when they realized, like, his wife is the real owner of Dred Scott? What do you think they accused him of? Abigail, do you have a thought or a comment here?
It's more like a question. Like, will Dred Scott ever be passed back to this original widow? I forgot her name.
Yeah.
But will he ever be passed back to her if her brother dies? Or does that
Yeah, she
depend
might
on
have. If her brother had died, she probably would have now had to do something else, with him.
oh, I
I
see.
would guess. I don't know. I mean, she kind of put her brother in charge. But yeah, everyone thought that this Dr. Chaffee, the new husband, was a total hypocrite, and he was not able to run for office again. because everyone was so like, I'm horrified to find out this truth about you. Um, and it's kind of, I think it's a life lesson, kids, that when you're ever, serious about someone, you're thinking about marriage, it's like, find out a little bit about their background, if they have any embarrassing skeletons in their closet. Um, but he really didn't know. And he did become like the congressional librarian in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years during the Civil War, and then just was practicing medicine there. Uh, I thought that was an interesting twist too, that the official slave owner of Dred Scott marries an abolitionist. And again, like Bishop said that, or somebody said that the sons who Dred Scott had grown up with as a boy, they became abolitionists and they were supporting him. And just a couple of other things. It has to do with this paying for it. I was thinking that, oh my gosh, I mean, to bring a case to the Supreme Court, it must take, like $500,000 or more, I mean, maybe less in older times. So I really wondered about the money bit. And it turns out that some money help they had at the very end when it really comes to the Supreme Court was from a guy named Gamaliel Bailey, who no one's ever heard of him, right? Gamaliel Bailey. And it turns out he was the editor of a newspaper called The New Era. That was the publication that published the novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. You all know which novel? Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he published it. Do you know how it was published originally? Like, was it immediately a book or something else? Suna, do you have a...
I'm not sure, but I'm guessing from the time period that it came like a newspaper serial kind of thing.
Yeah, it was like and then this week we're giving you chapter 1. Next, stay tuned for chapter 2. Be like a way you could keep selling your newspaper, boost your circulation because everyone wants to get to the next chapter. Just like, if you're watching a series on Netflix or something, it's like, oh, I can't wait till the next episode comes out. So it was that sort of thing. So they published the whole book. I mean, she hadn't written the whole book. She was writing it chapter by chapter, and they were publishing the various chapters. And it was a big hit. So he made a lot of money publishing Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was pretty wealthy by this time. That was published, just a couple of years after the Compromise of 1850. That was the thing that spurred Harriet Beecher Stowe to write against slavery. And so this Gamaliel Bailey is in Washington, D.C., and he finds out that the Dred Scott folks need some money. But here's the amount of money they needed. The Dred Scott case had incurred $63.18 in court costs and $91.50 for the printing of briefs of like the lawyers' arguments. So not $100,000, but still more than, Dred Scott could easily pay. Although he did early on, he put of his own money $500 towards the case. And so this Gamaliel Bailey, who would have had enough money to just pay that, but he wanted to get all the new Republican legislators involved and get them on board with this case. So he went around, sent a notice to all of the 75 representatives and senators that were from the new Republican Party. He said, I want you to support this case. $2. That's all I'm asking, $2. Often if you ask for something that's small, people might be more ready to give it. And then they're all giving it. So it seems like everyone's doing this. We're all supporting this. So that's how they did. And then if it wasn't quite enough, Gamaliel Bailey would throw in the rest to cover the whole thing. And it was that National Era publication, Gamaliel Bailey's one, that published those 2 dissents that Anna read and a few of the rest of you read those, he published them before the Tawney decision came out. He published those dissents and was the first to publish them. Oh, and wait, there was one other funny little story. Where is it? I'm looking at my notes here. I can't. Oh, yes. Just today, I found out, I mentioned before that one picture that I showed you of Dred Scott. That was the only picture that was ever taken of him. Slaves did not generally have pictures. But what would be your guess? I mean, I can tell you what my guess was that, when that picture might have been taken and why. Rainbow, what would be your guess?
For the court case?
Yeah, like maybe when he was going through the court case, they said, "Okay, we want to take your photo," maybe like a mugshot or something, or just to publicize it. Right. That's what I thought. It was probably some time during the court case. Do you have a thought, Walter? I see your hand up. Or
It was actually from before that. I was just pointing out that, like, it's kind of like ironic that all these people spent so much money on his court case, and like think of how many slaves they could just bought and freed,
Mhm.
right? Like with the same money. I mean, like
Yeah.
I guess they were really trying to gamble because but they should have at least, knew that there was a possibility with a Taney Supreme Court that like it wasn't going to get very far,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Pick your battles and pick where you're gonna against who, know your opponent. Right. That they probably didn't choose it wrong. By the way, initially, Dred Scott had suggested to his owner, I forget, probably this Dr. Emerson, that he wanted to purchase his freedom. He wanted to buy his freedom, and he had some money. He even had someone else in St. Louis that would kind of back him up. Like, I'll give him credit and then he'll pay me back, that sort of thing. And his owner said, no, you can't buy your freedom. There were always some cases where slaves did save up money that they'd make on the side, save up money and purchase their own freedom. And he proposed doing that, and it wasn't allowed. Kaylee, your thought?
I was actually looking up how much like $100 would be, like how much that would be worth kind of
Yeah.
today in that time period. And it said about 4,154.
Okay.
So kind
Yeah.
of put it in perspective.
I'm so glad you did that. That's great. Good. Thank you. Rainbow.
Going back to like the misspelling with Sanford and Sandford, going forward, which spelling do we use?
We use sand Ford with that extra D in there. That's
Okay.
how it is. And I remember being really confused, like, wait, is it Sanford or because I'd hear about that name, like this Mrs. Emerson's last name was Sanford. And it's like, why is it? I didn't understand that, but it was apparently some clerk along the way misspelled it and that kept in there. So that's how it is. I've never seen it spelled the correct way. You don't correct all these things. Oh, but I found out just today about that photograph. The photograph was taken after the case had been ruled against Dred Scott and made all these other rules about slavery could be everywhere. And within a month, there had been an arrangement made through this Dr. Chaffee, the new Mrs. Emerson's new husband, the abolitionist. He arranged to have Dred and his family sold back to those Blow brothers, the two brothers who had grown up with Dred Scott and were now abolitionists, sold to them because they still lived in Missouri. And then he was freed. So within a month of the bad, horrible decision, Dred Scott was a free man. But this horrible ruling was still stood. But anyway, at that point, when he's a free man, maybe a few months later, Leslie's Weekly comes up and they want to interview Dred Scott. Leslie's Weekly was like Harper's Weekly. It was like a weekly newspaper. And and they always had a lot of images. They couldn't print photographs in them because they didn't have the technology to print photographs in newspapers at that time. But they would, take a photograph and then make a sort of engraving, make a print from it, kind of tracing over it. So anyway, these photographers and reporters come out there to St. Louis. They find where Dred Scott is living, nice and quietly with his wife and 2 daughters. And they want him to, because this Leslie's Illustrated Weekly basically needs images. So they wanted him to have his picture taken so that they could then put it in the newspaper. And they were going to write a little article about him, what his life is like now as a free man. And what do you think, Dred Scott? He'd never had his picture taken. What do you think he thought when they wanted him to have his picture taken? What would you guess? Walter, what do you think?
He was probably like, I don't want my picture being on the internet. That's private.
Right. Basically exactly what he thought. Right. It's like, no, don't go with that social media stuff. No, not for me. And
Like my first name is enough.
yeah, right. And yeah, he was very suspicious. It's almost like in my area, we have an Amish settlement about 25-minute drive from us. And the old order Amish there, I mean, they ride in horses and buggies and, wear these really old-fashioned clothing. And they will not allow photographs to be taken of them. If you're there as a, sort of tourist in their little area and they see you taking, a phone or, camera, they'll they'll practically, the Amish equivalent of giving you the finger, they'd be really irritated and angry. They would think it was you were making an image of them, and this was against biblical teachings, would be their way of looking at it. No graven images. And so yeah, he felt suspicious, superstitious about photography. He'd never had this done. No one in his family, no one he knew had ever had their picture taken. He wasn't going to have his picture taken. His wife was against it. And these photographers had to come back like 3 days to sort of, the wife is saying like, well, how could I get my picture taken? I don't even have anything that would look nice. They say, oh, actually, you look very nice. You look really good. That's a very nice new dress you have over there. I think you look great. And finally they got a friend to like sign something that says, oh yes, these guys are fine. You should have your picture taken. So he comes over and he gets his picture taken. That's his one picture. They took a picture of his wife and then of the 2 daughters. And those were the pictures, the only pictures of them. And the article was absolutely fascinating. I'll put the link to it when I post this recording tomorrow. A link that lets you read this whole article about them, where they're interviewing him. And Dred Scott actually said to this reporter, he said, they have it written in sort of black dialect style. But he said, if I'd known this was going to take so long, I never would have done it. If I'd known it, I know I felt the same way. My husband and I, most of you probably don't know this, but we were very involved in Pennsylvania back, well, when did it start? Probably starting in the late 80s, the mid 80s or 83 or something like that. We started pushing for a law change in Pennsylvania for homeschooling. And we were very active. I mean, there were other people involved, but we were some of the top people involved in that. And we thought it would be very easy. I went to my representative. He said, well, this is a good idea. We'll come up with legislation and yeah, we'll see we'll see where it goes. We thought, oh, wow, we're going to get this in a month. This is a piece of cake. 5 years later, we finally got a law that was much, much different from what we had originally gone in with. And, it took forever. And I've often said to people, if any of us had had any idea that this would take 5 years and this much traveling across our large state to get to the state capitol to meet with, hundreds of people about this and all the time we had to put into it for 5 years, I don't think we ever would have done it. That it was kind of good we didn't know how long it would take. And Dred Scott felt the same way about his case. If he'd ever known how long it would take, he never would have done it, never would have agreed to it. And but there he was, and but they just wanted to live a quiet life. They didn't really want to be in the headlines. Although Dred Scott did kind of, he thought it might not be a bad idea to go in a speaking circuit and go around the country because, you know, he was famous now, and his wife wouldn't hear of it. She wouldn't allow it. So he went along with her. By the way, they had two daughters, and why would their two daughters were literally hidden during the time when the case was really active at the end? They were hidden away. Somebody else was taking care of them. Why might they be especially concerned about their daughters who were part of this whole case? It wasn't just Dred Scott, it was Dred Scott and his family. Chris, what do you think?
I don't know, maybe they could threaten to sell their daughters or something.
Yeah, that they really didn't want their daughters to be slaves, and that they might be sold away. And they were young, good-looking girls, and they knew what would be in line for them if they continued to be slaves. They were partly not just doing it for themselves as the parents, but for their daughters. They didn't want their children to be enslaved, and especially their daughters. Rainbow?
Yeah, they might get like sold or married off in some way as well.
Yeah. Well, abuse. There was so much abuse among slave owners with, you know, nice young women who were enslaved, and the sexual abuse, and that was rampant. I remember reading in a number of places a number of years ago that there was a belief among slave women that it would be a very lucky thing if you were ugly, if you were not pretty. Can you see what the thinking was? You might not be the top choice of the owner. So that would be good. That would protect you. And yeah, so his daughters, I mean, Dred Scott died, but his wife, who was much younger, she was like 15, 20 years younger than him. She was like a teenager when she married him. And she and her daughters were free. And they have descendants today. They still have, there's a Dred Scott Foundation in St. Louis that actually holds regular events to commemorate the case. And they've actually named like a little street in St. Louis as Dred Scott Way. You can take the little more minor streets and change the name. And so they have Dred Scott Way there. That was done in the early 2000s. And their descendants are involved in this organization. I mean, they know that, oh yeah, my relative was Dred Scott. It's known. Apparently in the 1920s, 1930s, there were some historians that claimed, I mean, nobody knew much about, what Dred Scott was like as an individual, but they were claiming, oh, he was a no good Nick. He was a drunk. He didn't have any skills. He didn't have any, oh, he was ignorant. He was this and that. They painted this really negative view of the person, the man. And then that got reformed as we got into more modern times. And now I say there's a Dred Scott Foundation. And there was actually a very touching meeting between some descendants from Dred Scott and descendants of Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Justice. They met and in Baltimore, and they all kind of, forgave each other. And it was kind of touching. But yeah. Anyone else have any closing arguments? We're coming up on an hour and a half, so I got to let you go. Anyone have some closing thoughts? Did anyone not get a chance to say anything and you want to say some final comments so you can take that extra points for saying something? Okay. Abigail, you've got something, or Walter? I see your hands up. Abigail, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just some interesting arguments made in this entire decision. I think one of the paragraphs I've chosen, it talked about how the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional
Yeah.
because he wanted to interpret it within the context of when the Missouri Compromise was ratified. It was saying that I think it said that the Congress has interpreted the permission of being able to enforce peaceful regulations and prohibitions like prohibitions of slavery over a certain border in within the U.S. territories as any territory. But in reality, it only applied to the territory owned or claimed like during the Louisiana Purchase.
Hmm.
So he was really saying that they needed to interpret these documents within their own context. And since that circumstances has changed, it does not necessarily apply to what they're doing right then. So I think this was really alarming for the anti people who are anti-slavery because essentially the slave owners can just do anything to interpret things as pro-slavery within that sense and just rule everything as unconstitutional.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Good point. And Walter and then Kaylee.
Yeah, one thing that I think that this whole period before the Civil War really illustrates is the sort of the struggle between going with one's personal moral convictions and actually getting something done, like progress, right?
Hmm.
Because like a lot of the things like the Compromise of 1820, 1850, really those revolved around like, okay, there's gonna be some things that we don't actually like about this and that go against our moral convictions. I mean, on both sides, right?
Hmm.
But then it
Hmm.
actually got something done. Whereas
Yeah.
like, had the more radical abolitionists like Garrison,
Hmm.
uh, and certainly there's a lot of radicals on the other side too, who wouldn't, have
Right.
any compromise right at all, and
Exactly.
would just say, all right, we're going to burn the Constitution and like,
Right.
you know, do all these things just because that's what we think is right.
Hmm.
But I think it really illustrates that like the sort of struggle between fully adhering to your moral convictions and, compromise and getting something done is something that, was really illustrated back then. I would say is even illustrated, now in modern policy making. So I think that's
Yes. Right. Yeah, we can see that like the sides just not wanting to compromise. And all these, by this time too, all those great compromisers, Henry Clay has died. All those people from the Compromise of 1850, dead. They are no longer, they were old guys. They died right after. And so yeah, there's a new generation of leaders and they're much less ready to compromise. By the way, there was one compromise, and I wrote this to some person, I can't remember who now, in my response to your PSDA. There was one senator from Kentucky, Henry Clay's state, is kind of known as the compromise state, who after Lincoln had been elected and states are starting to secede, he's like, wait a minute, we can compromise. And his compromise, his idea became known by his name, Crittenden. It became the Crittenden Compromise. And he proposed to say that, okay, we need to amend the Constitution. And this amendment would put the Missouri Compromise line and make it go all the way to the Pacific. So I would even say that California, the southern part of California, would be a slave. Everything there can be slave. Everything above it free. And they will put right in the Constitution that slavery can never be abolished. Can you imagine if that compromise had been passed? Because as the Constitution stood, it just didn't mention slavery. It didn't say it couldn't be abolished. It was viewed as a state issue, kind of, sort of, mostly. But it certainly didn't say, and the federal government can never abolish slavery. It didn't say that. But now this Crittenden Compromise was trying to say that it could never be abolished. Like that was the agreement. And okay, we won't try to go farther north, but you can never touch it down here where it exists. And that did not pass. But I want to just close our last final tiny thing. This was right in um, the PSDA assignment, but it was a little quote from Lincoln in his speech the House Divided speech. And I just thought it's such a good one, and some of you might not have had a chance to read it. But here it is. This is his House Divided speech, where he's basically the famous line of "a house divided cannot stand," which is, anyone get the biblical verse there? It's a biblical reference from Matthew or Mark, maybe both of them. Anyway, at some point in the speech, he says, "We shall lie down, pleasantly dreaming that the people of Missouri are on the verge of making their state free." And apparently there had been some movement in the state to switch, being a free state. Or at least St. Louis was thinking, like, we're going to declare freedom here in St. Louis. "We shall lie down pleasantly dreaming that the people of Missouri are on the verge of making their state free, and we shall awake to the reality instead that the Supreme Court has made Illinois a slave state." And I think that's an interesting, good final quote to leave you with. And thank you all. You all get that extra, how many extra points do I give you if you stay for the whole thing? Whatever it is, 100?
I think 100.
100, yeah. Yeah, 100. 200, 200. An extra 100 for staying the whole time. And thank you so much. You all had so many good ideas and we're jumping right in all the time. I really appreciate it. Okay. See you guys and wave to everybody here. Okay. Thank you. Love you.
Thank you for
Bye.
class.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you for your
you.
time.
Thank you for class.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Kaylee. Yes, it is.